Once upon a time, in a temple built for worship but scarred by fear, a baby cried in the dark, not loudly, not like most newborns. It was more like a whisper of grief, a sound too soft for soldiers, too quiet for traitors. But for those listening closely, it was a sign that hope had survived. The hallway beneath the temple was narrow and cold, stone pressed against stone carved long ago for quiet things, linen, oil, the priest's tools. But tonight, it held something far more sacred. A child. Jehoiada moved slowly through the shadows, a single clay lamp in his hand. He was old enough to know fear, but faithful enough to move through it. Jehoiada had served as priest for many years, through the reigns of kings both good and wicked. He had seen altars burn with holy fire and others drowned in blood, but never in his lifetime had he seen a day like this. The house of David had fallen, or so they said. Queen Athaliah had seized the throne with iron hands and venom in her heart. She had ordered the slaughter of every royal son, every possible heir, and she had done it swiftly, cruelly, without mourning or mercy. The kingdom had grown silent under her reign. Worship had dimmed. The temple grew emptier. The people bowed their heads, not in prayer, but in fear. But Jehoiada's wife, Jehosheba, had not bowed. She had whispered for him to meet her. She had run through the back corridors of the palace, past guards and danger and death, with a baby hidden in her arms. Now Jehoiada reached the source of the cry. In the back linen chamber, between stacks of forgotten cloth and sealed jars, she was waiting. Her face was pale, her eyes full of something between terror and urgency. She held out the child. "Take him!" "Who?" Jehoiada's voice faltered. "Joash," she whispered, "son of Ahaziah, the only one left." Jehoiada didn't reach out right away. He looked down at the boy, swaddled, tiny, royal, a king, hidden in rags. "No one can know," Jehosheba said, "not even the other priests. Not yet." Jehoiada nodded, finally taking the child into his arms. He didn't speak, not because he had nothing to say, but because the weight in his chest was too great. He had held sacred vessels, he had carried holy scrolls. But never before had he carried a promise so fragile and so dangerous. He glanced toward the temple walls above them, where the sound of footsteps could still be heard. There was no army here, no guards. Just a priest, a faithful woman, and a baby the world thought was dead. But God was not done. Not with the line of David, not with the kingdom, and not with Jehoiada. The child did not cry again that night. He slept, curled against folded temple garments, the hem of a priestly robe pulled over him like a makeshift blanket. Jehoiada sat nearby, knees stiff, eyes unblinking, hands clasped as if holding something too holy to drop. The silence around them wasn't peaceful. It was tense, sacred, almost heavy. As if the walls themselves knew what was hidden inside them now, a king swaddled in secrecy, tucked between clay jars and faded fabric. Jehoiada barely moved. Every creak from the upper halls made his breath hitch. Every shift of the torchlight made him turn, expecting armored footsteps. But none came. Jehosheba returned before dawn. Her hair was tied back, but a loose strand clung to her cheek, damp with sweat. "I brought goat's milk," she whispered, kneeling, "and honey bread, just a little." She looked at her husband and saw what the night had carved into his face, resolve and something deeper, grief. "I can still take him back," she offered, though her voice betrayed the truth. She wouldn't. Not even if Jehoiada asked. He shook his head. Number he stays. They worked quickly. The back chamber, once forgotten, became a hidden nursery. Jehosheba lined the floor with old temple rugs. Jehoiada repurposed empty storage jars to store food and linens. They set a curtain across the narrow entrance just in case anyone wandered too close. No one could know. Not yet. The boy had royal blood in his veins. If a single whisper reached Athaliah's ears, even the temple would not be safe. In public, Jehoiada carried on as always, offering sacrifices, reading from the scrolls, speaking solemn words in the temple courts. He greeted the priests, led holy days, and answered questions from confused worshippers who still dared to come. But in secret, he sang lullabies. He whispered scripture to a child who could not yet speak. He taught Joash the names of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and paused when he came to David. His voice always softened then. From his line, Jehoiada would say, pressing his hand gently over the boy's chest, comes the promise. Joash grew quickly. By the second year, he could stand. By the third, he repeated words from the Psalms. By the fourth, he asked questions. "Why can't I go outside?" he once asked. Jehosheba turned her face away. Jehoiada knelt beside him. Because sometimes the most important things must be hidden until the right moment. Joash nodded, though his small brow furrowed with confusion. "But you said I'm special." "You are," Jehoiada said. "But sometimes a promise must grow in secret before it can lead in public." Outside the chamber, the world only darkened. Queen Athaliah's rule tightened like a noose. She filled the city with images of Baal. The temple grew quieter. Fewer families came. The sacred songs of Judah faded like smoke in a windless sky. But inside the linen chamber, Joash's voice grew louder. So did Jehoiada's prayers. One night, after putting the boy to bed, Jehoiada sat beside the flame and stared into it. "He's growing," Jehosheba whispered from the corner. "Soon he'll be too big to hide." "I know," Jehoiada murmured. She leaned closer. "And then what?" Jehoiada didn't answer right away. He looked toward the curtain where a small shadow rose and fell with sleep. "Then," he said quietly, "we stop hiding the promise and start preparing the people." The days turned into months, and the months into years. Most of Judah believed the royal line was gone forever, that the bloodline of David had been drowned beneath Athaliah's rage. The palace shimmered with her power now. Golden idols glittered from the courtyards, and foreign gods stood where holy things once rested. But deep within the temple, behind stone walls and hushed corridors, a child laughed. Joash had grown from a bundled cry to a curious toddler, chasing shadows between folded garments and crawling over piles of wool meant for the priestly robes. He didn't know he was a king. He only knew that his mother sang soft songs at dusk, and that Jehoiada told the best stories by lamplight. "Why is the temple so quiet, Abba?" the boy once asked, blinking up with wide, questioning eyes. Jehoiada smiled faintly. "Because sometimes the world forgets how to worship, but God hasn't forgotten us." By day, Jehoiada walked the outer courts of the temple, his steps echoing in the hollow spaces where singers once stood. The altar was still there, but cold. The incense bowl was polished, but empty. Offerings were rare. Fear had driven the faithful underground. At night he knelt in the chamber beside the linen room, where Joash now slept on a cushion wrapped in soft priestly cloth. Jehosheba often sat beside him, candlelight warming the corners of her weary eyes. "How long can we keep this up?" she whispered one evening. "What if someone finds out?" Jehoiada didn't answer right away. He rubbed his forehead and stared at the flame. "When the time is right," he said finally, "God will speak." "But what if he waits too long?" she asked. Jehoiada looked toward the chamber wall. On the other side, the future king snored softly, unaware of the destiny curling around his dreams. "He won't," Jehoiada said. "Not if we're listening." So they waited. In the temple, Jehoiada repaired what he could, quietly, carefully. He taught the younger priests how to read the scrolls again, how to sing the ancient songs. He whispered hope into old men's ears and reminded them of the covenant, not loudly, just enough to keep the fire from dying, but the city outside pulsed with power and fear. Athaliah grew crueler. She filled the palace with Baal's priests. She walked with arrogance in the streets, and she had no idea that just a few hundred steps away, behind sacred walls, a boy she had tried to kill was learning how to pray. One night, as a storm rolled over Jerusalem and lightning split the sky, Joash sat up in bed. "Abba," he whispered, eyes wide. "Was that God?" Jehoiada chuckled softly. "No, little one, that was thunder." "But could it be him?" Jehoiada nodded slowly. "Sometimes, yes." Joash lay back down, eyes still searching the ceiling. "Do you think he'll talk to me one day?" Jehoiada looked at the child and felt the weight of 1,000 years press against his heart. "He already is," he said. Outside, the storm raged. But inside the temple, the flame still burned, waiting. The 7th year had come. 7 long years of hiding, praying, waiting. Joash was no longer a child with chubby fingers and wide-eyed questions. He stood a little taller now. His voice, though still young, held weight when he asked about the temple's silence and the king who never came. But that silence was about to break. Jehoiada rose before dawn that morning. He wrapped his linen sash with trembling fingers, not from fear, but from something deeper, a stirring, a knowing. The time had come. He moved through the temple like a man walking into a promise, his sandals brushing the ancient stones as the sun slipped across the sky. His eyes scanned the courts, empty still, but not for long. By noon, shadows fell across the temple gates as men began to arrive. Quiet men, loyal men, warriors who had once served the house of David, now reduced to guarding doorways and carrying water jugs so they wouldn't be seen as a threat. But today, they came armed beneath their robes. Captain Benaiah stepped forward first, sword hilt tucked beneath his cloak. "You called, High Priest?" Jehoiada nodded. "Close the gates behind you. No one leaves until the covenant is made." One by one the guards came, Levites from the surrounding towns, commanders from Judah's tribes, not many, but enough. Enough to light the match. They gathered in a shaded chamber just off the inner court, where Joash waited, nervous but brave. His small fingers gripped Jehosheba's hand, but his chin stayed high. "Who is this boy?" one soldier asked, uncertain. Jehoiada stepped forward, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "This," he said, "is the son of Ahaziah, the grandson of David, the rightful king of Judah, hidden, yes, but not forgotten." Gasps echoed. Some wept, some bowed, all knelt. Jehoiada lifted his hands over the boy's head. "We make a covenant this day," he declared. "We will protect him, crown him, and restore what has been stolen." The men laid their swords before the altar. Joash blinked up at them, his chest rising and falling fast. "What happens now?" he whispered. Jehoiada knelt beside him, a fierce gentleness in his eyes. "Now, we fight without drawing swords. Now we wait for the trumpet. Now, little one, we trust." And high above them, unseen by earthly eyes, the heavens stirred. The promise was waking. And so was the queen. The temple courtyard had not seen this many feet in years. Whispers passed like wind between columns as Levites took their places. Shields glinted beneath priestly robes. Hands that once carried censers now gripped spears. Joash stood behind the pillar, dressed in robes too large for his frame. His crown, small, hastily fitted, rested awkwardly above his brow. He looked like a boy playing dress-up. But his eyes said otherwise. Jehoiada stood beside him, tall and steady. His hands trembled only once, when he reached for the ram's horn. "Are you ready?" he asked Joash, low enough for only the boy to hear. Joash swallowed. "I think so." "You don't have to feel ready," Jehoiada whispered. "You only have to show up. God does the rest." Then, without another word, Jehoiada raised the trumpet to his lips and blew. The sound tore through the temple courts like a battle cry and a lullaby all at once. It echoed across the city, through alleyways, through balconies, into bakeries and markets and bedrooms. People stopped, turned, listened, and the gates of the temple burst open. Criers shouted, priests lifted torches, the guards, once in hiding, lined the courts in gleaming formation, and then they brought out the boy. Joash stepped onto the platform with eyes wide and shoulders square. Jehoiada placed the crown properly on his head, then pressed a scroll into his hands. "The law of the Lord," he said, his voice echoing. And then, loud enough for all to hear, "Behold, the king's son reigns." The crowd gasped, and then it began. Shouts, weeping. A roar of praise rose like thunder. But in the palace, Queen Athaliah heard it too. She bolted upright, knocking over her goblet. "What's that sound?" she hissed. A servant ran to the window. "My lady, it's coming from the temple." "What sort of sound?" The servant turned back, pale. "Trumpets!" Athaliah's face darkened. She reached for her sword. "Then we're not too late." The palace gates flew open like a beast unchained. Queen Athaliah rode hard, her royal cloak whipping behind her like a banner of blood. Soldiers trailed close, confused but loyal. They had heard the noise too, trumpets, shouts, the name of Joash. And Athaliah knew what that meant. "They dare raise a king without my word," she spat. "They forget who rules Judah." She reached the temple steps as the crowd surged with praise. Jehoiada stood guard near the altar, one hand steadying Joash, the other gripping the priestly staff. His face did not flinch when he saw her, only his eyes narrowed. Then the moment split open. Athaliah climbed onto the stone platform and screamed above the noise, "Treason! Treason!" The people froze. Some gasped. Others backed away. For a heartbeat, the world tilted. Jehoiada did not move. He waited until even the trumpets fell silent. Then, with surprising calm, he raised his voice, not in anger, but like a judge reading a final sentence. "You," he said, pointing his staff, "murdered your own blood. You shattered the house of David, but the covenant was not forgotten." Athaliah turned, wild-eyed. "You think this child is king? He is nothing!" Joash trembled, but did not retreat. He held the scroll tighter. "I am the son of Ahaziah," he said, voice shaking but steady, "and I will walk in the ways of the Lord." The silence cracked. The guards, once silent priests, stepped forward in perfect formation. Jehoiada spoke again, this time to them. "Do not kill her here, in the house of the Lord. Take her outside. Let her end come where her wickedness began." Athaliah's cries turned to curses as she was dragged down the steps, out through the horse gate, her screams trailing behind her like smoke. And then it was over. The boy still stood, breathing hard. His hands clutched the scroll like it was life itself. Jehoiada knelt beside him and whispered, "The storm has passed, but the rebuilding begins." Joash looked up. "I'm ready." And Jehoiada believed him. The sun was barely above the rooftops when Jehoiada led the people into the heart of the temple courtyard. The air still held the weight of Athaliah's reign, like smoke lingering after a fire. But in its place now was something new, something sacred. Jehoiada stood on the same platform where Joash had been crowned and lifted both hands, not in power, but in surrender. "This day," he called, "we make a covenant, not just with our king, but with our God." A hush swept over the courtyard. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. The people listened, hungry for hope. Families pressed forward, farmers, merchants, widows, and warriors, faces worn with fear, now glowing with the first signs of faith. Jehoiada motioned to the Levites, who brought forward a thick scroll, the covenant of Moses. With Joash at his side, Jehoiada unrolled it and began to read, not with flair or drama, but with reverence. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart." The word struck chords in old hearts and sparked fires in young ones. The people wept, not from sorrow, but from recognition. They had forgotten who they were, and now they remembered. When the reading ended, Joash, though still small, stepped forward with trembling hands. "I promise," he said, "to walk in the ways of the Lord all my days." One by one, the leaders of Judah came forward, the heads of families, the elders, even the weary guards. They each laid their hands over the scroll and repeated the words, "We will serve the Lord." Jehoiada turned toward the temple entrance, toward the place that had been defiled by false gods and wicked altars. His eyes narrowed with determination. "It's time," he said. Joash blinked. "Time for what?" Jehoiada looked at the boy with a fierce gentleness. "To tear down what never should have stood, and build again what was always meant to be." That afternoon, the temple roared. With hammers and saws, the idols of Baal were smashed, the false altars were torn stone from stone, dust filled the air, but so did laughter. For the first time in years, the house of the Lord was being cleansed. Joash watched as craftsmen began to rebuild the sacred tools, the basins, the lampstands, the censers. He leaned closer to Jehoiada. "It's going to take a long time, isn't it?" Jehoiada smiled. "All good things do. But don't worry, we're building more than just walls." "What do you mean?" "We're building a nation again, from the inside out." And Joash nodded slowly, understanding that this was not just the end of a wicked queen's rule. It was the beginning of a revival, Jehoiada ran his fingers along the edge of a half-buried cornerstone, the one nearest the eastern wall where the morning light always struck first. The priests had uncovered it during the temple's repairs, a massive, weathered stone with strange carvings barely visible under the dust of years. Joash crouched beside him, eyes wide. "What's that?" "It's older than I am," Jehoiada said with a chuckle. "Maybe even older than your great-grandfather." The boy's face lit up. "That's old." Jehoiada nodded, brushing the surface until a single Hebrew word gleamed faintly in the light. "Remember." Joash tilted his head. "Remember what?" Jehoiada didn't answer right away. He sat on the stone, motioning for Joash to do the same. "This temple was built with more than gold and wood. It was built with promises, some spoken by kings, some whispered by prophets, some carved into the very stones. That word, Joash, it's more than a memory. It's a warning." Joash leaned in. Jehoiada's voice lowered. "Remember who you are. Remember who God is. And remember what happens when a nation forgets." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of rebuilding echoed around them, chisels ringing against marble, workers shouting in rhythm. But in the space between the noise, Jehoiada saw the weight of kingship settle more deeply on Joash's shoulders. Then a soldier ran up, breathless. "My lord," he said, addressing Jehoiada, "there's trouble." Jehoiada stood, eyes sharpening. "What kind?" The soldier hesitated. "A group from Athaliah's guard. They fled during the coronation. We thought they'd disappeared, but now they're stirring trouble in the outer villages." "Loyalists?" Joash asked. "Some, but others. They've begun spreading rumors that Baal's anger will fall on Judah, that Joash is a cursed child." The boy's face paled. Jehoiada's jaw tightened. "Then it's time they hear the truth." He turned to Joash, laying a hand on the boy's chest. "You carry more than a crown. You carry a covenant." Joash looked uncertain. "But I'm just a boy." Jehoiada knelt, eye to eye. "And so was David once. So was Moses, hiding in a basket. God doesn't choose by age, Joash. He chooses by heart." Joash took a shaky breath. "What should I do?" Jehoiada rose slowly, lifting his staff. "You'll come with me. We'll speak truth where lies are growing, and we'll remind the people who really sits on the throne of heaven." As they left the temple together, Jehoiada paused and glanced back at the stone. "Remember." He whispered the word under his breath and walked into the rising heat of the day, not as a priest hiding in shadows, but as a warrior of the word. The sky over Judah was bright and sharp, but the countryside carried a weight in the air. A strange silence hung over the hills where grain should have been singing in the breeze. Instead, smoke curled from a burnt threshing floor, and villagers whispered behind closed doors. Jehoiada and Joash stood at the edge of the field watching as a crowd gathered around a scorched wooden altar, one not built for the Lord. "This was for Baal," Joash murmured, his voice trembling. Jehoiada nodded solemnly. "They rebuilt it, in secret, probably out of fear." A woman stepped forward from the crowd, eyes hollow with grief. "They told us, if we didn't offer sacrifices, our children would die. The rains would stop. The soldiers would return. We didn't know what else to do." Jehoiada stepped forward, raising his hand, not in anger, but with authority that came from years spent in prayer, not just power. Listen to me, people of Judah. Baal never saved you. Baal didn't rescue this child king from the sword. Baal didn't split the sea or feed our ancestors in the wilderness. Only the Lord has done those things, and he hasn't changed. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, uncertain. Then Joash stepped forward, small but steady. His voice didn't carry like a warrior's, but it didn't need to. He rescued me. I should have died as a baby. I was hidden because God wanted me alive. And now I'm your king. Not because I'm strong, but because he is. The crowd hushed. Jehoiada turned toward the false altar and struck it with his staff. The brittle wood cracked with a loud snap. A gust of wind kicked up dust, swirling it into the air like ash. Men came forward quietly, first 2, then 10, breaking the remaining pieces until nothing was left but a pile of splinters and shame. And then something unexpected happened. A young boy ran forward, no older than Joash, holding a slingshot. "Can I help build a new altar, one for the Lord?" Jehoiada smiled, his throat tightening. Yes, you can." Others joined in, mothers bringing stones, fathers kneeling to pray. No temple gold, no grand trumpets, just faith, just wood and stone, just hearts turning back. By nightfall, a simple altar stood on the hillside, and though it wasn't as grand as Solomon's, Jehoiada knew. This was the kind of worship that shook kingdoms. Because fire didn't need to fall from the sky to prove something holy had begun. It had already started, in the hearts of the people. That night, Jehoiada couldn't sleep. The stars blinked quietly above the temple roof, but something pressed on his chest like a weight no rest could lift. He sat alone by the inner courtyard, a lamp flickering beside him, casting tall shadows against the stone. The echo of the people's repentance still stirred his soul, but so did something else. A whisper. Not from the crowd, not even from Joash, from God. Warn him. The whisper had come again and again for 3 nights now, always the same, quiet but clear. Warn Joash. Jehoiada rubbed his weary eyes. "But he's still a boy," he whispered aloud. "He listens. He loves you. He's obedient." But still the whisper came. "Warn him." Behind him, Joash stepped into the courtyard. The boy wore a blanket over his shoulders, and his curls were tousled with sleep. "I couldn't sleep either," he said, yawning. "You always come here when you're thinking hard." Jehoiada smiled softly. "The Lord and I talk at night. You know that." Joash sat beside him, curling his toes under the blanket. "What did he say?" Jehoiada hesitated. "Something I don't want to hear." Joash waited, not pushing, just listening, the way he always did with Jehoiada. So Jehoiada spoke. He said that one day your heart might change, that your love for him might be replaced by love for yourself, or power, or pride. Joash's face tensed. "Why would I turn away? You've taught me everything. You saved me. You showed me the temple. You taught me the law." Jehoiada placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "And I will keep teaching you, but Joash, I won't always be here." The word stung more than Joash expected. Jehoiada looked out at the sky, voice thick. "My bones are old. The Lord has given me many days, but one day, too soon for both of us, you'll lead without me." Joash looked down at his hands. What if I don't know what to do? That's why I'm warning you now, Jehoiada said. Don't let flattery fool you. Don't let princes distract you. And above all, don't let the temple become just a building. Keep it holy. Keep your heart soft, or everything we've built will crumble. The wind stirred the palm trees outside the wall. Joash whispered, I won't forget. I promise. Jehoiada didn't speak. He simply looked at the boy he'd raised like a son. He hoped that promise would last, but God had shown him enough to know that not all promises do. And still, he prayed. Because warnings, like seeds, must be planted in faith, even when you're not the one who will see them grow. The courtyard was silent. No music, no cheers, no horns or drums, only the steady shuffle of sandaled feet and the soft weeping of priests as they carried the body of Jehoiada toward the burial chamber. Joash walked behind them in royal robes that suddenly felt too big, too heavy. His steps were slow, not from grief alone, but from a weight he'd never known without his mentor beside him. The kingdom mourned. For days, all of Judah had remembered Jehoiada as more than a priest. He had been the shepherd of a scattered nation, a shield during Athaliah's reign, a teacher, a counselor, a father to a boy who should have died in a queen's slaughter. And now, the shepherd was gone. Joash stood beside the tomb, tears pooling in his eyes but refusing to fall. 1,000 thoughts rushed through him, memories of secret lessons, temple repairs, long walks, and quiet warnings. But what haunted him most were Jehoiada's last words. Don't let the temple become just a building. The stone door slid shut. And for the first time in Joash's life, Jehoiada didn't follow him out. That evening, the palace filled with visitors. Princes, advisors, distant cousins with polished teeth and easy smiles. They brought gifts, flatteries, and whispered promises. One leaned close. Your Majesty, you are no longer a boy in the shadow of a priest. Your king, Judah, is yours. Another added, the people follow you now, not the temple. You could build monuments, extend the borders, make your name great. Joash said nothing at first. He just listened. Too long. The next morning, he sat on the throne without his priest at his side. The scrolls of the law sat untouched on the shelf. And the temple? He didn't visit it that day. Or the next. Somewhere deep in the temple chambers, an old oil lamp burned low. A young priest passed by it and whispered under his breath, We miss you, Jehoiada. Because in the silence that followed the funeral, something sacred began to fade. And in the corridors of power, flattery began to speak louder than truth. But heaven was not quiet. Because God still watches over promises, even the ones his people are beginning to forget. It began with whispers. At first they seemed harmless, mere talk of easing temple laws, shifting funds, making practical choices for the people. But before long the altars of Baal rose again, their stones bright and polished in the sun, mocking everything Jehoiada had spent his life tearing down. And Joash, he said nothing. He had once stood trembling beside the pillars of God's house, clutching the crown with wide eyes and an open heart. But power had changed him. Or maybe, without Jehoiada's voice in his ear, the truth had simply grown faint. And now, surrounded by flatterers and merchants eager to please, the king who had once rebuilt the temple allowed idols to grow in its shadow. But God does not forget his servants. One afternoon, as Joash sat listening to plans for a new fortress in the north, the guards at the gate announced an unexpected visitor, not a soldier, not a noble, a young man in simple priestly robes. His eyes were sharp with grief, and his voice trembled not with fear, but fire. He stepped into the hall with no title, no permission, and no gold to offer. Only words. "King Joash," the young priest called, standing tall before the throne. "This is what the Lord says. Why have you turned away from the commandments of God, who gave you your kingdom? Why do you allow idols to steal the hearts of the people? You have abandoned the Lord, and now he is calling you to return." Joash froze. He knew that voice, not the tone, but the spirit behind it. The boy's name was Zechariah, Jehoiada's son, and the words he spoke felt like the echo of his father's voice, cutting through the noise, shattering the comfort of compromise. But the throne room did not respond with repentance. An advisor sneered, "Shall we let this child insult the king?" Another nodded. "He defies your rule, my lord. Let him be made an example." Joash looked down. His hands trembled slightly, but he gave the order. Just a gesture, a nod. And Zechariah, his mentor's son, the boy who had grown up with him in the temple courts, was dragged away. Outside the city walls, where stones were used for justice, Joash remained in silence as shouts rose and then fell quiet again. The next morning there was blood on the dust. And for the first time, the heavens were silent. But just before his final breath, Zechariah had looked toward the palace, his eyes locked on the great golden roof of the temple, and he had whispered, "May the Lord see and avenge." Not in hatred, not in vengeance, but in grief. Because sometimes judgment comes not to destroy, but to remind the living God does not overlook betrayal, even when it's committed by a king. The days that followed Zechariah's death were not filled with triumph, as Joash had hoped. There were no songs, no cheers, no parades, only silence. The people had seen what happened to the prophet's son, and though they still bowed when Joash passed, they no longer smile. In the palace halls, Joash heard echoes, not footsteps, ghosts, memories. His own voice as a child, asking Jehoiada to explain the scriptures. The feel of his small hand gripping the priest's robe during prayer. The warmth of the temple courtyard in the morning sun. But now, it was all dust and shadow. And every time he tried to pray, the heavens felt locked. Then came the letter. Not from a prophet, not from a noble, from the neighboring Arameans. It arrived in the form of a threat, wrapped in silk, sealed in wax, and soaked with confidence. A message Joash read 3 times before his hands finally stopped shaking. They were coming. Not with fanfare, not with warning, with swords. And there would be no Jehoiada to guide him this time. The soldiers of Judah braced themselves. The walls were watched day and night. The city fasted and offered sacrifices, but Joash knew deep down God was not among them. When the attack came, it was swift and precise. The Arameans moved like shadows, cutting through the outer cities and charging the palace gates before the morning incense could even rise. Joash, desperate and broken, hid in the inner chamber, the very one where Jehoiada had once whispered, "You are the king, but God is King of Kings." He remembered that now, but too late. A blade found him in the chaos, not from an enemy, but from someone he knew. One of his own men, one whose loyalty had died the same day Zechariah did. Joash collapsed in the chamber he had once been crowned in. And the crown fell beside him, rolling across the floor like a question no one could answer. His final breath was not a roar, but a whimper. No crowds mourned, no songs were sung, no banners flew. He was buried in the city, but not among the kings. The people remembered Jehoiada, they remembered Zechariah, but Joash became a warning. They buried Joash without a parade, without honor, without the scrolls of the law carried before him. The same people who once cried, "Long live the king," now turned their faces away. But the story didn't end in the grave. Not every seed dies in the dark. Years later, in a quiet corner of the temple, a new priest rose up, a young man with fire in his eyes and scripture in his bones. He had heard the stories. He had memorized the law. But more than that, he had learned the cost of silence. His father had been a priest. His grandfather had been Jehoiada, and he had not forgotten. "Revival," he whispered one morning as he swept the steps of the altar. "It starts small, like a whisper in the linen chamber." The scrolls were still there, hidden, preserved, sacred. The scars of betrayal still marked the city, but they had not erased the truth. Faith had flickered, yes, but it had not gone out. And in the minds of some, there was still the memory of Jehoiada, the man who stood against the queen, who lit the flame of reform, who crowned a child in secret and risked everything to preserve a promise. Though the king had failed, the priest's legacy endured. Not in statues or songs, but in hearts, in hidden rooms, in whispered prayers passed down through generations, and in the end, God had not been dethroned. The candles still burned in the temple. And somewhere, deep within the chamber walls, if you listened carefully, you could still hear the sound of a baby's cry, the sound of a promise kept,